All right, this is about an hour's worth of cleanup sculpting condensed down to about 11 minutes and 22 seconds. So basically just going through here and doing a little bit of box modeling update. Use Trim Dynamic to kind of trim some edges down. Remember, Trim Dynamic doesn't respect edges, so it goes through in the brush samples, and you can have it cut across surfaces. So here we are. This previous video on extracting complex shapes. Now that's one thing we didn't talk about. You can actually extract and then make a Boolean out of that. Resulting mesh, if you wanted to kind of try that method. But here we're just kind of closing holes and moving stuff around. You could also do the bridge technique where you bridge edges and close holes, get a little bit of a nicer result. Kind of depends on whichever one's faster, and again, what kind of result you're looking for. And a lot of this stuff too is when I'm refining, I'm not necessarily refining for a final shape. I'm refining for something I'm going to end up rebuilding later. Now, of course, this thing I didn't end up rebuilding a lot of it because it's just like a concept sculpt. But if you were working towards like, hey, you know what, I just want to separate these pieces out real quickly with the idea in mind that you are going to rebuild it, you can be a little bit, I don't want to say sloppy, but you can be a little bit looser with how you go about that. Pick and choose your battles. So here we go, and masked out around the eyeballs. I want a nice clean cut around here. Of course, you could polygroup that and then run an IMM brush, which we're going to get into later, and have those be your panel cut lines, or you can use the chisel brush if you have a really steady hand. I do not, so but this one I just went ahead and popped off, made it its own mesh. You can see I did a polygroup and I Z-remeshed that result and turned it into its own geo. So instead of rebuilding the geometry using Z-spheres, just use Z-remesh and let it do the heavy lifting, especially if you don't need particular perfect points placed somewhere. A Z-remesher is great for especially like loose organic shapes like that. Here we are just putting some IMM brushes in here as a Boolean. So we already talked about Booleans, and these are just simple IMM Boolean, just kind of getting those simple shapes put in there with live Booleans there, and go through and group by normals and then bridge these across using ZModeler to get these shapes. And I'm just using the Terminator reference here, going through and stitching 2 points, and then going through and slicing. And then, just using ZModeler to kind of make that complex shape based off of the pre-existing geometry I already had, which was those cylinders. Just kind of borrowing, duplicating that subtool off, and borrowing that geometry, which we've done previously. Now on the eyeballs, we basically borrowed the geometry that's already there, just duplicate it off, and then use those edge loops to make something new, or bridge between two edges. And now we're just using the live booleans to kind of make that a little bit closer and neater. And of course, ZModeler is great using the Q mesh or the extrude, holding down shift along a polygroup. If you start pulling a polygroup with extrude or Q mesh and then hold down shift, it'll pull along the surface normal, which is super useful. And then here again, we're borrowing the pre-existing geometry, and we're deleting those caps and then just Q meshing or extruding those thicknesses. So again, if you already have geometry there, just borrow it. There's no point in going in and doing a bunch of IMM additions. Just go through and just recreate, especially simple geometry like this is just basically a bunch of cylinders. Go through, you know how to use a ZModeler brush. You've watched those videos already. And then this is like a little destructive, but once you're done, Dynamesh it all together and run a little smooth over it. And that'll be the complex interior shape. And you can leave all this stuff separate, And then going through here, we can kind of bridge across connected polys. So you hover over a face and you say bridge connected polys, and then you say circle. And maybe we'll go over some of these techniques after this video is done. Some of the basic. And then you already know all about, you can slide edges. Just hover over an edge and go to slide, but you know already about dynamic subdivision. And this, I'm deciding whether I want to Dynamesh this complex shape or not. And I think at the end of the day I do. But again, even if you do Dynamesh something, you can always rebuild it. It's not rocket science. It might take you a few minutes, but here we are masking out this little piece here. And again, if you don't feel like just masking and extracting, you can always Z-remesh it, and then you have a little bit more leeway as to, hey man, just use ZModeler and get a nice clean line result. As opposed to dealing with a bunch of geometry, you can just deal with less geometry. There we go. Z-remesh. And then go through and collapse that edge down, and then decide what gets creased, what doesn't get creased. And you can always mask entire edges there too, so you can pick which verts you want to move around. And even after doing all this, in this particular instance, I just duplicated it off and did a Boolean, Dynamesh Boolean, because the other underlying surface is Boolean. Of course, if you don't want to do that, you can just make it a live Boolean. Here again, borrowed some geometry around the eyeballs, and just to have it like a little seeding on the inside there. It makes it a little bit more seeded. Again, just a bunch of Z-modeler stuff. And you'll notice a lot of it is just alt painting and then extracting, which we've already talked about, or extruding, I should say. Nothing fancy at all. Moving simple points around using your dynamic subdivision, which we talked about before. Borrowing geometry if it's already there. And then at the very end, if you want to Dynamesh all of it together, this one got a little messy because the Dynamesh was thin, and I didn't realize it went through the back, but that's easy enough to chop off and close holes and re-Dynamesh and clean up. This is just me dragging out some alphas, which we'll get into. Just kind of doing some alpha exploration. This we'll get into later as well, how to go through and make like a recessed port for like putting a screw into. So you take one side and you slice through an object, you duplicate it off, and you Dynamesh one side and you do a Boolean on the other side. That just makes it so you can get a little screw head on the inside there, and then you can have a little fastener on the one side. And just going through here, the basic IMM brushes, you go BI, brush insert, and they go narrow it down to all your eye brushes. Those will be your insert mesh brushes, and there's a ton of stuff in there, little hardware screws and little sci-fi things. And of course you can make your own IMM brush if you'd like. And here I am going through, and I'm just gonna, this is the technique we talked about earlier, which is slicing and then Dynameshing. So using slicing to kind of slice nice, easy, even parts off, and then using clip brush to kind of go through and clip. Getting some ridge detail along here, and then masking and pulling out these sides. Again, it's always nice when things look like they work together. You can make shapes that kind of pull in, and this is why I like using ZBrush for this type of work too, is I don't have to think too hard about like, oh, I got to cut in edges, make sure it resolves, make sure that it's a sub D that's going to work nicely. I don't have to worry about that. I just go, I want to mask through here, and I want to push this in, and that's the functionality I need. And then I can make the decision, do I want to rebuild it? Or do I want to go through and rebuild it either with ZModeler, if I want to just Z-remesh it, or if I want to rebuild it with Z-spheres, or if I want to remake it using primitives now that I know the shape I want. What's the most efficient way or effective way to rebuild it if I need to? A lot of times, turns out I don't need to. Even in super non-destructive instances, there's a lot of times where it's like, wow, make it non-destructive. You can always go back and change it. Well, there's a lot of instances where you make it super non-destructive and super smart, and you never end up changing it anyway. So as long as it's not costing you time, that's fine. Here I took a sphere. We're going to bridge these two, so we have that like that Terminator-looking bridge between these two surfaces. I just took a sphere and then sliced it in half and moved one side up, and moved the other side down. Kind of used the one side as a Boolean, duplicated it off. Same thing for here. I'm going to use one side as like a Boolean through the mesh, and then I'll merge down on the other sliced half and Dynamesh that. So I re-Booleaned it out. I'm going to merge these, and now I can smooth it down, and now I have a countersunk little area here that I now have two flat surfaces I can bridge. When things are getting, if you start poking through a mesh, make sure you have backface masking on. You can always thicken that up. And this is just simple ZModeler stuff. Just drop a cylinder in there, and this is a simple mask and gizmo, little move brush. Trying to decide what type of functionality I'm looking for, and I'm looking at reference from other Terminators and just going through here. And this is very simple joint setups. It's basically, let's go ahead and stick this over here and rotate this around, and this can clamp onto here. And then this little clamp area we can make a little bit more. We can go into ZModeler, Alt tap these faces and extrude them out and bevel them out, and basic Z modeler functionality. My YouTube's, just Google Z modeler on my YouTube channel, and that'll take you to like 10 different. They're all the basic same information. There's Z modeler get started and ZBrush for ideation. We'll walk you through the basics of Z modeler in that series too. Go to my playlist on my YouTube channel. I think a lot of people don't realize most of my stuff is in a playlist. That makes sense if you watch the videos in order. That might help you out too. And then here we're using the topology brush to go through. I'm going to try and get a nice clean edge around this. So I'm going to take this thickness and then use a live boolean for that. May or may not work that well. In that case, it didn't really. But there's always multiple ways to skin a cat in ZBrush, which you said before. So I can go through here and I can just mask where I want that line to go. And then after this video, I think I'm going to talk about using that path to drive a cut line. So we're going to go through here. We're going to Z modeler this shape out. We're going to use this as a cutting device. We're going to frame that border, and we're just going to cut through the detail with a live boolean controlled. On my YouTube channel, do controlling curves, and that'll give you a lot of information on how to control your curves for stuff like this.